Hello and welcome to the Womb Centered Healing Podcast. I'm Sama Morningstar and I have Alexandra here with me. Thank you so much for joining me, Alexandra. We're going to be talking about vaginal steaming. Surprise, surprise. This is not the first podcast, but I wanted to talk to Alexandra because she has some unique perspectives and makes her own herbal formulas and works with a diverse population of clientele and teaches all over in the Southwest primarily, or do you travel other places too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to hear
Mostly
about that.
Southwest.
Yeah, mostly in the Southwest. Okay, so please introduce yourself more, share more about your work, how you learned about vaginal steaming, and as I said before, I'm really curious to hear how it also, a lot of people get into vaginal steaming for physical ailments, physical aspects of healing, and I'm also very curious to hear how people use vaginal steaming and herbs to address emotional healing, particularly healing from trauma, womb trauma, and other traumas. So, so I'd love for you to introduce yourself and share a little bit about that, how you got into steaming and those topics.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me here. So yes, I'm Alexandra and originally I'm from Denver, Colorado, and I currently reside in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I am a certified innate postpartum care practitioner and a community herbalist. I'm also a student. I'm currently working on my bachelor's in science and biology, and I'm also an artist. So there are lots of studies of mine, but they all kind of relate, and that's just such a gift in my life. And so when I first started learning about these things, particularly herbalism, because I learned about herbalism before I learned about birth work, which helped me understand womb care better. It was 8 years ago, and I began in this little school called Moondance Botanicals. It's in Denver. And my teacher, her name was Tanya Reikley, and she taught a lot about, she taught goddess studies incongruent with herbalism and how those two related. And we would do one herb once a month and for 9 months. So we only learned about 9 herbs in super depth. And during that time of the more intense apprenticeship that I took in 2014, that's when I was introduced to vaginal steaming. And we did talk about the medical uses, and we also talked about the energetic and the metaphoric and the spiritual uses of vaginal steaming. And then I got to New Mexico in 2000. I arrived in 2016, and I started an apprenticeship with a curandera from Mexico. And that's when I learned that steaming is also from Central South America. It's a very ancient remedy from there. It's also from Sub-Saharan Africa. It's also from Korea. And I think there are lots of parts of the world that we don't know about, but that know about steaming. And so in Central South America, they're called bajos, which just means underneath. And so now I'm starting to dive in with the perspective of curanderismo and that the concept of curanderismo and how I can intertwine it with steaming and why it can intertwine. And it's made some remarkable, it's carved some remarkable depth for me about vaginal steaming, for sure. So that's where I'm at right now.
Beautiful. And so you said you're currently studying with a curandera from Mexico, apprenticing, if you will. And I'm very curious about that. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, how that's deepening the steaming practice for you, and what's different about learning from this curandera than from when you learned before?
So I met my mentor, my maestra, 3 years ago. Her name is Cici Nava, And when I joined the apprenticeship, you join what's called a Kalpulli, or it's a school basically. And so it's called Kalpulli Teocalli Ollin, which means the four movements. It's like spiritual school. I think it's not the exact or not the exact translation, but it's basically like that's the concept. It's like the four movements school. It's a spiritual school. And so so when I was learning about energy work and how to give what's called limpia or platica. Platica is like a heart-to-heart conversation, and limpia is a cleansing, or like, limpio, like the word clean. It's a cleansing. It's an energy cleansing, and part of the way that I make the medicine my own practice and make the concept curanderismo into a lifestyle is applying it to what I'm already doing. And that's just what I did. That's what changed for me. That's when I kind of took vaginal steaming a little bit more seriously. I was trying to make my curanderismo practice my own. And vaginal steaming has always been an ally of mine, a remedy of mine that I've come to over and over and over again. And so I kind of took the concepts of what happens in Olympia. Olympia, you are energetically put back together in a way. You're cleansed with herbs and waters and holy items and sacred tools that have been charged and blessed, and you can do the same in a vaginal steaming. So it kind of like upped the ante a little bit, and I was able to like, what time do I want to steam? What water am I steaming with? Why? And these herbs that I learned originally before with Tanya, I was able to put them. It was like they came more from my heart when I was learning about curanderismo, because curanderismo taught me more about these herbs, but it taught me the energetic like depth of the herbs more so than I learned from Tanya. Tanya taught me a lot. I learned a lot. That's for sure. But I had to continue my studies, and as I did, I learned a lot more than I had did before. Like, for example, rosemary. Rosemary is a really common herb used in the Southwest in Mexico for cleansing, for limpias, to clean your floors with, to clean the air with, to come back after a traumatic episode. To, let's say you had an accident in the car, you would use rosemary to bring yourself back into your body. And so I took all that information and I just applied it to the steaming, basically. And that's how I've been able to deepen that practice with curanderismo. So yeah, it's very influential.
Does your mentor include steaming and all of this? It sounds like you're just learning about limpias and that steaming isn't part of it, and you're making steaming part of it. Is that the case?
Yeah, exactly. So no, it was not something that was emphasized in my teachings ever. But the point and the beauty of curanderismo is that it's so unique to the practitioner. It's not this rule book you have to follow. There are guidelines, but you put in your world and you make it a very personal thing. You make it a lifestyle. And I wanted to be a womb health educator. And so I'm just combining those two worlds my own way.
So
that makes sense.
There might be, and it sounds like, I mean, Bajos is a practice that I would think there might be some curanderas that focus on Bajos.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the case?
Yeah, there was. Yeah. Not my teacher particularly, but there are so many types of curanderas. There's body workers, there's spiritual workers, there's channelers, there's tarot card readers, there's people who give limpias, people who speak through roses. I don't know. There's so many different types of curanderas, and one of that is a midwife or a partera, and they for sure use that practice for sure. But that's not my particular teachings, but it will be. I hope one day.
Are you planning on going to school to become a midwife?
I'm planning on becoming something of that sort. So I'm kind of waiting till I'm a little older. Now I'm just focusing on postpartum work. And so my postpartum teacher studied with the midwives in Mexico. And when she did, I think that's when she learned about steaming too, although I'm not totally sure. But she mentioned it in our training. So I know that there's connection there, and so that's when I got more information about steaming from her. But not in the curanderismo apprenticeship. It was something else. So yeah, there's lots of things that I could take this to, and I think midwifery might be one thing when I'm a little older.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like from what we talked about before we started the recording, and also from what you're sharing here, that you're really weaving a lot of different influences together to really make your own practice, because it sounded like what you were sharing before we started, that your population that you teach and work with isn't just limited to postpartum women. Yeah, although you probably do work with some postpartum women, but you were talking about other populations too, different genders than you might expect to come for vaginal steaming. I'd love for you to talk about that and some of the diversity in population that are starting to want to learn about womb space, even if a person doesn't have a physical uterus, but that might feel like they have a womb space, which I totally agree that everyone has a womb space, whether they're aware of it or not, but that there are some people who are becoming aware of it and really seeking out womb healing through steaming, and that you're teaching them as well. Could you share some about that?
Yeah. Sure. Yes. No, yeah. I when I first began marketing my blends, there was someone who came to me and they shared a story with me of their friend who had just had the surgical procedure to create a vagina, and so now they had a vagina and they wanted to heal and then honor this transition. And so I recommended a blend, and I hadn't done that before. That was about 2 or 3 years ago. And it was the first time I ever worked with that type of client. And their feedback was really positive. It was really helpful for them to feel like they had something to just honor their new space, their new need to be able to experience that rebirth with them and honor it in that way. And so the steam was meant for physical healing and also an honoring, and that was beautiful. And so since then I decided that I would extend my invitation to learn about vaginal steaming and my products to more than just cis females, and cis meaning that they were born a woman and they chose to be a woman and they're still a woman. But like you said, and that's how I've been taught, is that we all have this womb space. We all have this center for creating. And there are times when I wish that I could recommend this to men, but I have yet to experience that, how to honor a man's womb space with a vaginal steam. I still have yet to get into that. But for trans people, it is something that does affect them and that can affect them. And I'm really happy to share it with them. So and so totally.
Have you had more than one person going through a transition, a gender transition that you've supported with vaginal steaming?
I've educated more trans people, but I haven't been able to work one-on-one like that again. I haven't had the chance yet, but I'm hoping that I still can, and that will continue. But I have a feeling that it's also it's a new concept. It's part of the newness to womanhood that they experience, or even the transitioning out of womanhood to manhood, and how do they, for me, what I think of is, there's a lot of body dysphoria that can come with transitioning. And so how does a trans man honor and protect and heal and love their womb space still? And I think a vaginal steam could be a way for that, because whether they particularly want it or not, they have a uterus, so they have that space. Maybe, I hope, you would assume that they still have that space. They might not anymore, but if they do, it's still there. It's still something to honor.
Right.
And so, yeah, I haven't had the chance to yet, but I feel like that's still a present need for people, so
yeah, there's so
happy to share that.
Right. And there's so many parts to that whole transition. There's the physical
Mm-hmm.
Changes that a person might go through, and then there's the emotional and spiritual changes
Mm-hmm.
that they're going through, and that's a real creative process in and of itself. So it seems like steaming might really nurture and nourish that creative process, and I feel that that's the case for anyone of any gender, whether they're in transition from one to the other or not, that steaming truly nourishes our root and our connection to creative life force, our connection to Mother Earth, and receiving her gifts into our root. It reestablishes that connection to that upward flow of vital energy from Mother Earth, from the herbs, from the water realms, and from the fire realms, from all the elements. And so, I just had to say a little bit about that.
That's beautiful.
So
no, that's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah. And so I'm really curious about, because anyone that we work with any gender, and even ourselves, I'm curious to hear your stories about how vaginal steaming, how bajos or steaming, some people call it pelvic steaming, right? Because it could be helpful for someone even if they don't have a vagina. So pelvic steaming, it can be very helpful, and the use of herbs can be very helpful recovering from a trauma, like you talked about the car accident, and particularly traumas relating to the womb, to our sexuality, to our gender. And I would love to hear any stories that you have personally or with people that you've worked with around that, how the steaming practice helped that recovery.
Yeah, as you're asking me that, I'm like, I well up with gratitude to have this practice. I did need it, and I think I was in a bit of a crisis. I had lost a child recently, and an unborn child, and there was and maybe it was a couple weeks after I lost them that I was still in my healing and mourning process, and I didn't really know how to let go enough to properly mourn. And so a steaming ritual just like happened. It just like, it's like it just had its own momentum, and it pushed me into it or something like that. And what happened was, and well, just to back up for a second, normally when I teach steaming, I recommend that it be a very sweet and sacred and honorable moment for whomever is steaming, but they make it a ritual that makes them feel good in all senses, that they hear good music or hear nothing, that they separate themselves from distractions, that they are kept warm, and maybe light candles and put on like a favorite fragrance or a favorite incense, and I ask, or I kind of guide them into making it like a ceremony of sorts. And so you could say that how I used it in this moment was kind of like a grieving ceremony or a grieving ritual, and I didn't really know how to mourn, and I was kind of feeling anxious. And so I had played music that I played right before I lost my child, and I started painting, because painting has always definitely been a medicine for me. And so I was listening to this music and I was painting, And I was crying and crying, and I was going so deep into my mourning and all this pent up grief that I hadn't let go of yet. And I didn't know what to do. I felt so in the air. I felt so in my head, and so in this pain, this trauma, um, of imagining and seeing, me losing this little being. And I feel like I had no other choice but to steam. I feel like that was the only thing I could think of that could help me. And so in my tears and in my my life just feeling like it's crumbling a little bit, I ran to the kitchen, I put it together, and that's the beauty of steaming, is that it's so accessible. It's so easy. It doesn't have to be complicated. It's such a good medicine for crisis, I think, actually, too, in my experience. And so I ran to the kitchen, I grabbed the herbs, and all I steamed with was rose. I just knew that rose, healing, gentle, uplifting, divine, feminine, and I just grabbed a bunch of it, threw it in, put it in hot water, and then sat and wept and was in my trauma, and I was alone. And luckily, I feel like I was spiritually strong enough to be alone and to be okay. Though I do feel like if you steam and your purpose and intention is to clear trauma, I always say, have a friend around, have a trusted sister around, have a trusted mother around that you feel you can shout out to or call to, when the moment comes when there's so much to bear, you can't leave that trauma, and they need to pull you out of it. And so I recommend that. And no one was around at the time, but I felt strong. So I had my steam, I had my ceremony, I wept and I went through it. And then I gave away and offered the steam in a good way to this little river next to my door, and that was my experience. And honestly, I feel like I couldn't have done it without it. I couldn't have mourned and been held and grounded and kept in honoring my mourning without this steam as my ally. Of course, there's other things we can use, but that for me is my medicine. And so that was my, it was my caretaker. It wasn't just my physical cleansing, it was my caretaker at the moment. It let me just expel.
Right. And Rose is such a powerful caretaker, I find too.
Totally.
I keep adding more rose bushes in the garden.
Oh, that sounds so nice. Yes. Protectors, caretakers, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so have you supported any of your clients or students through similar grieving or trauma recovery processes with steaming?
Not directly. I have recommended steaming for post-abortion, partners, and they've given me their feedback about what it was like for them.
How
was
that? What was that like for them?
So recently I had a sister who left in a relationship where she was felt very betrayed in, and I think she felt kind of dirty. I think she felt kind of like just icky, and she felt like full of this ick kind of energy, and like not I don't know, but that's the feeling I got when she was like, I need to steam. And the herbs that she picked, which was rosemary, just a very cleansing, very clearing herb, I had a feeling that she felt kind of like gunky, and the energy of her partner was so present in her, and which the energy of a partner entailing more than just just him, but also his energy and his story and his business. And so she, I think, felt all of that, and she wanted to let him go, and was ready to move on, and was ready to clear. And so she had a steam and she only picked rosemary. And she messaged me after on, and she was just, I think she was deeply moved. She said, you know, I took some time, I steamed, I cried, it rained, I saw rainbows, and you could just tell like there was this like beautiful shift that had occurred. And it was just so funny how like mirrored it was with nature and what nature was doing at the time. And you know, her tears and the rain and the sunshine and the rainbows afterwards. It was very sweet how it all happened. And that was the most recent thing I saw from, not necessarily trauma, but just stuck energy, stored emotions, and stored energy that wasn't belonging to her anymore.
Well,
You
and
know, and that, yeah.
that can be traumatic too. I mean, ending a relationship, and oftentimes, you know, in relationship, we can often take in someone's trauma from their past into our wounds, and that could be the source of the ick. You know, it might not have even been anything going on in the current relationship, although usually if somebody has unresolved trauma from their past, from their early childhood, it comes into play in how we relate to each other, right? And so and the reasons why a relationship might end might have to do with that, but also that, you know, that unresolved trauma, we're always kind of spilling it out on each other and into each other if we're having sexual intercourse and like that. And so I would say that it is related to trauma oftentimes in ends of relationships. That alone is traumatic. And then, like I said, things
good point
shared in our relations can be a result of that unresolved trauma. And then you also mentioned mentioned someone else you worked with that had a different kind of a trauma, that they had an abortion, I guess is what you said.
Yes. That was a little harder to get to them. I was working with them, and I think that there's so much shame around abortion. It's very hard to even talk to people who understand it, and for some people. And so we started working together, and then she was open, and then it didn't really follow. Nothing came of it. I mean, the offer, I mean, obviously I'm still available and I still want to help her, but nothing, she didn't reach out to me and say, okay, like I'm here, I'm ready, let's do this. It was, you know, it's and that just might be kind of her personality, but it's very touchy and very personal and very heavy. And so it's probably one of the harder traumas, I think, to work with, or it's the more, I think it can be the more complicated one to work with. But yeah, I have worked with that before, and with myself, and then with other people too. So yeah. It's very difficult, but it's a really beautiful ally I have found.
Yes.
Really good ally for that.
Right. And you know, it's the same kind of a thing, but much deeper and more complicated as, you know, the relationship. I mean, holding a child inside for a period of time, and then releasing that child, whatever the reasons were, whatever the process was. You know, you might have released that physical child, but there might be also a whole bunch of emotions and feelings around that decision, around that whatever happened, that are still held in there, and those are much more difficult to release. And then, of course, just there's so much there, and the steaming can be very helpful. The steaming can be helpful to help release all those other aspects and nourish a new, healthy, creative space. So for the healing process,
for sure,
beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, listen, we've talked about so many things.
I know.
So good.
We got through.
I'm
Wow.
I'm amazed that more time hasn't flown by. Usually talking
I know.
and I look at the clock so is there anything that like a core message that you would like to share um, with the audience on this womb-centered healing podcast about vaginal
Mm-hmm.
or anything else that you would like to, any words of wisdom that you would like to share with the audience here?
Sure. It's kind of an opinion, but I mean, it's not the opinion a final word, but I will say that vaginal steaming, as I'm sure you've talked about this or at least know about it, that it's very trendy. It's becoming a very trendy thing and something inside of pop culture. And just because something is in pop culture doesn't necessarily mean it's generic or overdone or fake or blah. Sometimes in pop culture does take things that are really, really wonderful, and this is one of those things. And so I just want to emphasize the importance of honoring the origin of steaming, that it doesn't have to be this luxurious, special, private thing that is only for cis females. It costs at least $80 to go steam at a very nice spa, and you have to get these certain you know okay, yeah. So as I was saying, it's important to remember the origins of this medicine, and that it's something that can be done in a very inexpensive, approachable way. It's something that we can use to bond as females, as sisters and mothers. It's something very special. And I think it's like when you harvest herbs, you want to do it in a way that honors the plant, that honors the earth, that honors the spirit of the plant. And I think this medicine is the same. You want to do it in a way that's really honorable to your body, that's honorable to your time, that's honorable to the powers of the water and the fire, using herbs that are clean, using water that's clean, using materials that are healthy for the body, as in no aluminum bowls or steel or things like that, but rather like glass and more cleaner materials are important to use. And so it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be this privilege. It can be something very easy, like reaching inside your medicine cabinet for a remedy. It can be that easy and that accessible, and I promote that heavily, and I encourage that for people who want to experiment, that it doesn't have to cost you an arm and a leg, and it doesn't have to be this weird thing that is so foreign, because we've been using it for hundreds of years.
Yeah, and a lot of people get hung up on the need for a special chair, a special steaming chair. Those can run a couple $100s, and
Yes.
and I always tell people you don't really need one. I'm curious how you tell people about
Yeah. When I teach, I just I bring a little glass bowl from my kitchen, and that's how I was taught, and that's how I teach. I think the stools are really nice, especially for those who can't sit on the floor comfortably or have a bad back. It's nice to have a little stool to comfortably sit in that's stable. But if if you think of child's pose, that's how I teach steaming, and that's how I steam myself. I get very comfortable. I get on the floor as close to the floor as I can, and I just steam with a shallow glass bowl, and that's how I've always done it, and it's always worked for me. And that can still reach to the pelvic steaming, meaning it doesn't have to just be for the uterus. It can also be for the rectum and for hemorrhoids, and that still works just as well, I've found. It's just a little glass bowl, and so again, really inexpensive.
How big is your glass bowl?
It's probably the one I like to use. Let's see. The diameter, I think, is about 7. No, it must be about 8 inches.
Uh-huh.
And it's pretty shallow. It's probably about 4 inches tall.
Okay. So you
Yeah.
boil your herbal water on the stove, and then you just pour it when it's still boiling hot into the glass bowl. How much do you usually put into that glass bowl?
I'll fill it about 3/4 of the way full.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be about 3 cups of water, 3 or 4 cups of water, and I'll steam with maybe tablespoon. If I want a lot of something there, I'll steam with 2, but usually just 1. And then I'll let that actually boil the water. I'll put that steep to get the water with a little heavier with the medicinal properties, and I'll cover it while it steams or steeps, and then maybe about 5 minutes into the steeping, I'll uncover it and then I'll steam.
Okay, so it's not very hot by then. The steam has cooled off quite a bit by then.
Yes, and that's good. That's good. You don't want it to be too hot. And I always tell people it's nice to be on the floor without a stool. That way you can adjust how close you are to the bowl. But by the end of the steam, I mean, my legs are wide open and I'm as close to the bowl as I possibly can be because it's cooled off by then. But when I start, I'm maybe about 6 inches above the bowl.
Uh-huh. So you're kind of kneeling and over the bowl.
Yeah.
And then you lower yourself closer and closer as the steam is cooling off. Do you ever end up sitting on the edge of the bowl?
Totally. Totally.
Uh-huh.
It feels so nice.
To just land on the bowl eventually, huh? Totally. And then do you how long does this normally last?
The steaming itself is probably 15 minutes. It doesn't last very long. But the whole ritual itself could be an hour of just preparing yourself, preparing the herbs, preparing the space, and then afterwards, lying down, maybe doing a little bit of stretching or just like a shavasana, just laying straight down, and maybe a journaling. Sometimes I feel like there are things that come out that I need to put words to, and so I'll journal. And that's why it's more of a ritual, because I encourage and I do myself take the time to at least have an hour distraction free where I can steam for 15 to 20 minutes comfortably and then have time before and after to prepare and then integrate.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And are you wearing clothes, or are you wearing, like, I like to wear a long skirt. Do you wear clothes or wrap yourself up?
Yeah, I'll wear a long skirt or even I'll usually wear a long dress that I can spread out in, that doesn't hold my legs together. So you want something very flowy, very open. And if anything, you can steam naked, but you do want to steam with something to cover your bottom torso down, like a towel even too, or just like a wide skirt. But yeah, and then I'll always steam. I try to put, I encourage people to stay warm, because it's like I feel like it's a very chi building process, and it's important to just keep the warmth and keep the juiciness of the steam that it creates in your body. And so, wrap yourself in a blanket, put a hat on, maybe socks, make sure it's not too cold on the floor, put a blanket down so you're not touching the cold floor with your feet, and just keep your root nice and warm is most important. Yeah.
And do you share with people counterindications for steaming, times when it's not the best thing to steam?
For sure. So the most obvious one is do not steam while you're bleeding by any means, whether you're bleeding after birth, a miscarriage, an abortion, your menstrual cycle, Do not steam at all when bleeding. What I was taught was that it can cause hemorrhaging. And it is counter. Something, your blood is flowing out and you're trying to put something in, and I feel like that just energetically creates this clash. And so you're already cleansing, you're bleeding, you're cleansing, you're letting go, you're shedding, and steaming helps promote that. So if you're already doing that, it's good to just let your body just go ahead and do what it's going to do. And if you want to bleed in a more efficient way, steam before you start menstruating, and then sometime after you menstruate. And there's a whole regime around when and how long and with what herbs if you want more of a sufficient bleeding. But yeah, so no bleeding. And then if there's an open wound that's not healed properly, if you right after a spinal tap at birth, why am I losing the name of right after epidural, sorry, I don't know why I missed the word. Right after an epidural, you don't want to steam immediately after the epidural is taken out, is what I was taught. And if you have a heavy bacterial infection, I was taught if you have a heavy bacterial infection, the water and the moistness could cause problems. If it's slight and small, it's not such a big problem. But if it's heavy and out of control, steaming might not be the right remedy for it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If you have like a serious burning itch right now, right?
Yeah.
Steaming might not be the thing. If it's mild, it could be very soothing. The herbs could help to calm down. But if it's really burning, you don't want to add more heat and more.
Exactly. Yeah. Something cooling or something. And I don't I've never been one to recommend ice. I don't recommend ice. It's not exactly the way I would go about, like, oh well, instead of steaming you should put ice on yourself. I would just say don't apply any intense warmth, unless applying soft warmth, gentle warmth, a warm water bottle, moxibustion topically is what I would recommend for certain things, like after birth, for example. It might feel good to put like an ice pack or steam right away, but I would wait a few weeks while things calm down, like you're saying, and not add more heat right away to something that was already had a lot of movement, had a lot of blood loss, had a lot of chi going through it.
So, and then of course, if someone is trying to get pregnant or is pregnant, that's not the best time to steam either, right?
If you're not pregnant, yes, thank you. I knew I was missing one thing. If you're not pregnant, or if you are pregnant, do not steam. That's what I recommend. If you're trying to get pregnant and you're absolutely sure you're not, is a safe way to steam. But if you're trying to get pregnant and there's chances, it's best not to. Mm-hmm. Obviously, because you might be pregnant. So, but if you're super, super sure you're not, it's safe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And sometimes recommended too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In fact, if you know that it's before you've ovulated, right? Mm-hmm. If you know that you haven't ovulated yet, you've menstruated but you haven't ovulated yet, and if you're trying to get pregnant, I hope you're tracking your ovulation, because that's where you're going to know when to be trying the most to get pregnant. So if you haven't gotten to the ovulatory phase yet, you don't see any fertile cervical mucus yet, then steaming can be very supportive to really nourish that ovulation. And to, help clear out any residue from your prior menstruation and prepare the womb for that pregnancy. And then once you ovulate and you're trying to get pregnant, that's when you don't want to steam again until after, if you don't get pregnant and you do start bleeding again, then before the ovulation, you could steam again, and it could be very supportive to the process.
Yeah, particularly fertility, definitely. That would be the process I recommend. And And then of course it's different if you're trying to help your blood come through. I might even recommend steaming right before your menstrual cycle. So so if it's both, that's a little more complicated, and I think would take a little bit more thought if it's both. But that safe window right after menstruation, hopefully, if it's regular, it's very difficult if it's not tracked and not regular, and letting things get regular before adding remedies like steaming is probably a good idea. Getting regular, and steaming could help promote regularity too.
Yeah.
So it's very unique situation.
The one thing that's the one kind of irregularity that I feel is important to mention is if women are bleeding twice per cycle, or having a lot of spontaneous bleedings that's not necessarily normal menstruation. So that's one thing that can occur, is that women's wombs can't hold the blood anymore.
Yeah.
And they're bleeding either continually or with only short periods of time of not bleeding in between bleeds. And so that kind of, if you're bleeding every 2 weeks, or you're bleeding, continually with only a few days of not bleeding, that would be another counterindication in what I've studied, that some women have that kind of thing where they just are always bleeding, and only a few days off here and there. And so steaming in that condition can exacerbate that bleeding overly much. And
for sure.
And so even if you'd manage to find a day when you're not bleeding, I still wouldn't recommend steaming until you have made it so that you're only bleeding once a month, and you've done that for at least 3 to 6 months consistently. And so for those women, I recommend seeing an acupuncturist who can help you to stop bleeding uncontrollably and so intensively. An acupuncturist or another kind of herbalist that can give you herbs to help internally, take internally, to regulate your cycle so that you're not bleeding so much, because it's not healthy for us to bleed that much.
No. Yeah, and that actually also reminded me too of to also avoid steaming if you have an IUD, which is unfortunate, but because it is one of the nicer ways of Western birth control. But to avoid steaming with an IUD, and it's a little risky.
And there's different opinions about that. That's some like a mild form of steaming, like what you described, where the steaming is not really hot, it's not for a really long time, and might be okay with an IUD. Some teachers say that it's okay, and then others say no.
I can see why.
Others say no, that wouldn't be okay because you're encouraging the womb to let go of things and to release things that are in there that it want to spit out, right? And so if you have an IUD in there, that's the whole way that an IUD works is that it's an irritant, and it prevents the uterus from feeling like it's okay to have a baby because it's irritated, right? And healing, the steam might heal that irritation, or it might encourage the womb to spit out the IUD, right? Get rid of the irritation. So there's all kinds of ways that it could interfere with the workings of the IUD. So I feel like you do, and yet my steaming teacher says that you actually can steam without causing harm and without doing that if you do it in a certain way. So
I can see where there's some controversy there. I have steamed with an IUD before and nothing came of it. But I've heard from so much to avoid steaming with an IUD that I'm a little bit confused myself, and I haven't worked with enough clients to have a for sure yes or no. But for me personally, I recommend to not but I've also experienced everything being okay if you
Yeah.
do. So.
And I feel we have to each connect with our own inner wisdom, our own inner wise one, and with our own lineage, and find mentors that we feel good about consulting with and like that. And when on these controversial points, come to our own self-responsibility and decision about what we're going to do.
Yeah.
So so wonderful to talk with you, Alexandra.
Thank you so
thank
much.
you for joining the conversation here on the Womb-Centered Healing podcast. And is there a way that folks can get in touch with you if they want to communicate with you more about your work?
Sure, yes. So I do have a Facebook page. It's just called Postpartum Care by Alexandra. And that is kind of the start of what will be a website soon. And so that's an easy way to get a hold of me. So Postpartum Care by Alexandra on Facebook, and my name on Facebook is Alexandra Grajeda. That's kind of difficult to spell. If my name will be displayed on here, maybe that will be helpful for the listeners. So because it's kind of complicated. But it's okay, good. Yeah, good. Like I could spell it, but it's kind of awkward last name. So
but
thank you.
Facebook.
Okay,
your
perfect.
Facebook
Then
sounds good, because
that's awesome.
Is a easy to spell name. So Postpartum Care by Alexandra.
Yeah. That's a good simple.
And then those of you who are listening who would like to learn more about the Womb-Centered Healing Temple, you can go to wombcenteredhealing.com and learn about the membership site there, and reach out to me through the contact page there if you like. And I look forward to hearing from you, and how all of these discussions on the podcast are landing for you. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for coming on here.
Thank you,
Alexandra. And that's all for now. Until next time.